The dust of the northern plains settled like a fine brown shroud over everything at the Wind River Sanctuary, a place that felt more like a final stop than a refuge. For 10-year-old Elara, the world was a tapestry woven from sounds, scents, and textures, a landscape she navigated with a grace that belied the darkness that had been her constant companion since birth. Blindness had not made her world smaller. It had simply taught her to see with her heart, a skill the sighted world often forgot it possessed. The sanctuary, run by her weary uncle Ben, was on the brink of collapse. Every bale of hay, every bag of feed, every bottle of medicine, was a testament to a dwindling bank account and a community that had long since turned its charitable focus elsewhere. Ben's face, which Elara could trace in her mind from the sound of his tired voice and the scent of coffee and worry that clung to him, was a map of their shared struggle. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Into this world of quiet desperation came a force of nature, a creature of myth and thunder captured from the wild heart of the plains. He was a massive bison, nearly a ton of muscle and matted fur, whose capture had been a last resort after he had wandered too close to ranch lands, deemed a threat by men who saw his wildness as a liability. They called him Koa, a name that meant warrior, but in the cramped steel enclosure at Wind River, he looked less like a warrior and more like a king in chains. From the moment he arrived, Koa began a silent, stubborn protest. He refused to eat. He stood motionless for hours, his great, shaggy head facing west, toward the open spaces he had lost. His eyes, which Ben described to Elara as holding a firestorm of grief, saw nothing in the sanctuary but the walls of his prison. The sanctuary's veterinarian, Dr. Anya Sharma, a pragmatic woman whose kindness was often masked by her clinical efficiency, had tried everything. They had offered him the sweetest hay, the richest grains, even wild grasses painstakingly gathered from the plains. Koa ignored it all. His protest was a slow, deliberate act of self-destruction, a choice to die on his feet rather than live on his knees. "We can't afford this, Elara," Ben had said on the 4th day of Koa's hunger strike, his voice heavy with a sorrow that felt as vast as the plains themselves. "He's a magnificent animal, but he's costing us a fortune we don't have. Dr. Sharma says if he doesn't eat by tomorrow, his organs will start to shut down. We'll have no choice." Elara heard the unspoken words hanging in the air, euthanasia. The final sterile kindness offered to a creature that refused to be saved. But Elara didn't believe Koa was refusing to be saved. She believed he was refusing to be understood. While others saw a dangerous, stubborn beast, Elara sensed something else. Standing near his enclosure, she could feel the low, resonant hum of his grief, a vibration that traveled through the packed earth and up into the solace of her worn sneakers. She could smell the scent of wild sage and distant rain that clung to his fur, a perfume of a freedom he was mourning. "He's not angry, Uncle Ben," she had whispered, her hand resting on the cool metal of the fence. "He's lonely. His heart is still out there, on the plains. He can't find it in here." Ben had sighed, the sound a mixture of love and exasperation. "Honey, he's a wild animal, not a storybook character. He's dangerous. I don't want you getting too close." But Elara's world was built on getting close, on touching and listening, and sensing the things that others only looked at. That evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in colors she could only feel through the warmth on her skin, Elara made a decision that felt as natural and necessary as breathing. She slipped out of the small house she shared with her uncle and made her way to Koa's enclosure, her bare feet making no sound on the dusty ground. The 50 feet of open space between the fence and the house was a familiar journey, one she had mapped in her mind 1,000 times. She knew the dip in the earth near the old water pump, the patch of stubborn thistle that grew by the gate, the way the air grew cooler and carried the scent of hay and animal life as she approached the enclosures. When she reached the steel bars of Koa's pen, the air was thick with the bison's silent, overwhelming sorrow. She could hear the slow, rhythmic huff of his breath, a sound like a lonely wind sighing through an empty canyon. He was standing in his usual spot, facing west, a statue of loss. "I know you're there," she whispered, her voice a soft counterpoint to the vast silence of the night. "My name is Elara. I can't see you with my eyes, but I think I see you better than anyone else here." The great beast didn't move, but the pattern of his breathing hitched for a fraction of a second, a subtle change that Elara detected instantly. She took it as an invitation to continue. "They think you're giving up," she said, her fingers tracing the cold, smooth surface of the steel bars. "But you're not, are you? You're just waiting. You're waiting for someone to understand that your body is here, but your spirit is still free. I know what that's like. To be in one place, but to live in another. Have you ever felt a connection with an animal that seemed to go beyond words? A silent understanding that you couldn't explain but felt deep in your soul? Share your story in the comments below." The fifth day dawned with a sense of finality. The air was heavy, the morning sun casting long somber shadows across the sanctuary grounds. Dr. Sharma arrived early, her truck kicking up a cloud of dust that settled slowly, like a sigh. In her hand, she carried the black bag that held the syringe and the vial of clear liquid that would end Koa's silent protest. Ben met her by the enclosure, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He had spent the night checking on the bison, hoping for a miracle, but Koa hadn't moved. The bucket of fresh alfalfa and sweet feed lay untouched, a testament to his unbreakable will. Elara had been awake for hours, sitting on the steps of the house, listening. She had heard the crunch of Dr. Sharma's tires on the gravel, the low, mournful tone of her uncle's voice, the metallic click as the vet prepared her equipment. Every sound was a tick of a clock counting down to the end. She stood up, her small frame filled with a resolve that surprised even herself, and walked toward them. "Please," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the mornings. Heavy silence. "Give me 5 more minutes with him." "Just 5, Ben turned, his face a mask of grief. "Elara, we've tried everything. It's kinder this way. We can't let him suffer." "He's suffering because he's alone," she insisted, her unseeing eyes turned toward the massive, silent creature in the pen. "He thinks no one understands. Let me try to tell him that I do." Dr. Sharma paused, her hand hovering over her medical bag. She was a woman of science, of facts and observable data. But she had also seen the way Koa seemed to listen when Elara was near, the subtle shifts in his posture that no one else seemed to notice. She looked at Ben, who saw the fierce, unwavering conviction in his niece's face, a conviction that reminded him so much of her mother. 5 minutes, Ben said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you do not go inside that fence, Elara. You stay right here." Elara nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. She walked to the fence, her hands finding their familiar place on the cool steel bars. The world fell away. Worried breathing and the vet's quiet movements fading into the background. There was only the dust beneath her feet, the sun on her face, and the immense, grieving presence of the bison just a few feet away. "Koa," she began, her voice a soft murmur. "They're going to give up on you. They think they're being kind. But I know you're not ready to go. You're just lost." She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts, trying to find the words to describe a world she had never seen to a creature who had lost his. "I know about wide open spaces," she whispered, her voice dropping even lower, a secret shared between them. My world is a big, dark, open space too. Sometimes when people talk about colors and shapes, I feel like I'm behind a fence, and their world is on the other side. They can't see my world, and I can't see theirs. It can be lonely. Koa's head, which had been facing resolutely west, turned slowly, ponderously, until his great, dark eyes were facing her. Ben and Dr. Sharma watched, frozen in place, as the massive animal took a deliberate step toward the fence, toward the sound of the little girl's voice. He was closer now than he had been to any human since his arrival. But I learned something. Elara continued, her voice trembling slightly as she sensed his proximity. She could feel the warmth radiating from his body, smell the earthy scent of his hide. I learned that you don't need eyes to see what's real. I can see the sun by the way it feels on my skin. I can see the trees by the sound the wind makes in their leaves. And I can see your heart, Koa. It's big and strong, but it's broken. You miss the feeling of the wind on the plains, and the taste of the wild grass, and the sound of your herd. She reached through the bars, her small, pale hand extending into the space between her world and his. It was a gesture of pure, unthinking trust. Ben started to move forward, to pull her back, but Dr. Sharma put a hand on his arm, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Wait," the vet breathed. Koa lowered his massive head. The horns that could gore. Man without a thought, the skull that could shatter bone, moved with an impossible gentleness until his wet nose was just an inch from Elara's outstretched fingers. He sniffed her hand, his breath warm and moist against her skin. And then Elara whispered the words that would change everything. "They can't take the plains away from you," she said, her voice filled with a certainty that was absolute. "Because you carry them inside you. Just like I carry the light inside me. Let me show you." With her other hand, she reached down to the bucket of feed that lay untouched by the fence. She scooped up a small handful of the sweet alfalfa, the texture rough and fragrant against her palm. She held it out to him, her hand steady, her heart open. "This isn't a cage," she whispered. "It's just a resting place. Eat, Koa. Get strong. So you can show them all the wildness you still hold inside." For a moment that stretched into an eternity, the bison stood perfectly still. The fate of the sanctuary, the life of the animal, and the heart of a little girl all hung in the balance. Then, with a delicacy that defied his immense size, Koa extended his great, dark tongue and gently, carefully, took the feed from her hand. A collective gasp came from Ben and Dr. Sharma. Tears streamed down. Ben's face as he watched the creature that had resisted every effort finally accept an offering from a blind child. Koa lifted his head, chewed thoughtfully, and then looked at Elara, a low rumble vibrating from deep within his chest. It wasn't a roar or a bellow. It was a sound of acknowledgement, of connection, of a promise kept. He then turned to the bucket and began to eat. If this incredible story of courage and connection has captured your heart, we'd be so grateful. If you could take a moment to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Your support helps us share more amazing stories like this one, and every subscription means the world to us. Thank you for being part of our community. The news of what the staff called the miracle at Wind River spread through this small community with the speed of a prairie fire. It started with Dr. Sharma's emotional phone call to a colleague, which was overheard by a local reporter who had come to her clinic for a story about his cat. By evening, the story of the blind girl who had coaxed a wild bison back from the brink of death was the lead item on the local news. A grainy cell phone video shot by a stunned Ben showed the unbelievable moment of Koa eating from Elara's hand. The footage was raw and shaky, but the emotion it captured was undeniable. It showed a connection that defied logic, a moment of pure trust between one of nature's most powerful creatures and one of its most vulnerable children. Within days, the story went viral. National news outlets picked it up, and suddenly, the struggling, forgotten sanctuary was the focus of a national conversation. Donations began to pour in. It started small, with $20 contributions from people in the local town who had been moved by the story. Then, as the news spread, larger checks began to arrive from across the country. A tech billionaire in California, an oil tycoon in Texas, a retired schoolteacher in Florida, all of them touched by the simple, profound image of a blind girl and a grieving bison. The sanctuary was saved. The threat of foreclosure vanished, replaced by a flood of support that allowed Ben to not only repair the dilapidated fences and buildings, but to dream of expanding their mission. But the true transformation was not in the sanctuary's finances. It was in its soul. The miracle had given them a new purpose. Elara, who had always been seen as a fragile child in need of protection, was now viewed with a sense of awe. Her blindness, once considered a limitation, was now understood to be the very source of her extraordinary gift. She hadn't seen a dangerous animal. She had seen a hurting soul, and she had responded not with fear, but with an empathy that was more powerful than any tranquilizer or cage. Koa, in turn, became the sanctuary's heart. His recovery was swift and complete. With regular food and care, his massive frame filled out. His coat grew thick and glossy, and the fire in his eyes returned, not as grief, but as a calm, steady strength. His bond with Elara was the foundation of his new life. He would come to the fence. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Whenever he heard her voice, lowering his head for her to stroke his face, his deep rumbles a constant conversation between them. He remained a wild animal, a creature of immense power, but with Elara, he was unfailingly gentle, a warrior who had found his peace not in surrender, but in connection. Inspired by the public response, Ben and Dr. Sharma began to rethink the sanctuary's entire purpose. People aren't just donating money, Dr. Sharma observed one evening, scrolling through hundreds of emails from supporters. They're sharing their own stories of loss, of feeling misunderstood. Elara and Koa have tapped into something universal. They decided to create a therapeutic program, a place where people, especially children, who were dealing with their own traumas or disabilities could come and connect with the rescued animals. The idea was to create a space where healing was a two-way street, where the animals and humans could help each other find what they had lost. The first to visit was a young boy named Leo with severe social anxiety, who hadn't spoken a word in 6 months. His parents brought him to Wind River as a last resort, hoping the quiet, natural environment might help. For 2 days, Leo remained withdrawn, hiding behind his parents and refusing to interact with anyone. On the 3rd day, Elara took him to meet Koa. She didn't push him to talk. Instead, she stood with him by the fence and simply described the bison to him in her own way. "Can you feel how steady his breathing is?" she asked Leo softly. "It's like the whole world is rushing around, but he has this calm, quiet place inside him. He knows that being strong doesn't mean you have to be loud." Leo watched as Elara spoke. To Koa, saw the massive bull respond to her with gentle rumbles. He saw a power that wasn't threatening, a silence that wasn't empty. Slowly, he reached out his own small hand toward the fence. Koa, seeming to sense the boy's fear, remained perfectly still. And then, for the first time in half a year, Leo spoke. "He's big," he whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. Elara smiled, and from that small, simple word, a new chapter of healing began. The Wind River Therapeutic Sanctuary became a beacon of hope. Its success built on the simple principle that Elara had understood instinctively, that true connection happens when we stop looking at the surface and start listening to the heart. Do you think that our greatest perceived weaknesses can sometimes be the source of our most profound strengths? How can we learn to see the world less with our eyes and more with our hearts? 5 years passed, and the dust at Wind River Sanctuary no longer felt like a shroud of desperation. but like the rich, fertile soil of a place where miracles were cultivated. The small, struggling refuge had blossomed into a world-renowned center for animal-assisted therapy, a testament to the enduring power of a single act of compassion. Elara, now a confident and articulate 15-year-old, had grown alongside the sanctuary. She was no longer just the blind girl who had saved a bison. She was a co-founder, a guide, and the living embodiment of the center's philosophy. She moved through the expanded grounds with an effortless grace, her knowledge of the animals and the landscape so intimate that visitors often forgot she could not see. Her world was not one of darkness, but one of profound light, a light she radiated to everyone she met. Koa remained the sanctuary's soul. He had grown even more magnificent with age, a majestic patriarch who presided over the herds of rescued horses, elk, and other creatures that had found a home at Wind River. His bond with Elara had deepened into a silent, intuitive partnership that continued to mystify scientists and inspire visitors. He was her guide in the physical world, his presence a steady anchor, while she was his guide in the world of the heart, a constant reminder of the trust that had saved his life. The therapeutic programs had helped hundreds of people. Veterans with PTSD found a non-judgmental peace among the herds. Families grieving a loss found comfort in caring for orphaned animals. And children with a spectrum of challenges from autism to anxiety discovered they could communicate in ways that transcended words, forming bonds with animals who accepted them without question or condition. On a crisp autumn afternoon, the sanctuary was hosting a visit from a group of children from a nearby school for the deaf. Elara was leading the tour, her voice translated into sign language by an interpreter. She brought the group to Koa's sprawling enclosure, which now opened into a vast protected pasture. Koa teaches us that you don't need to speak to be heard, Elara explained, her hands resting on the familiar top rail of the fence. He spent the first part of his life here in silence, but his silence was a roar of grief. Now he speaks with his presence, with his calmness, with the way he cares for the other animals in his herd. As she spoke, Koa ambled over from the far side of the pasture, his massive form moving with a quiet dignity. He came to a stop before the group, his intelligent eyes taking in the silent, watching children. One little girl, a 7-year-old, named Maya, who had lost her hearing to a fever 2 years prior, was visibly frightened by the bison's immense size. She hid behind her teacher, her small hands clenched in fear. Elara, sensing the girl's anxiety without needing to be told, knelt down. "It's okay to be scared," she said, her voice soft and reassuring as the interpreter signed her words. Koa looks very big and strong, and sometimes things that are big and strong can seem scary. But his heart is the gentlest thing in this whole sanctuary. She turned her face toward the massive bull. "Koa, this is Maya. She's a little afraid. Can you show her that you're a friend?" What happened next was a moment of pure Wind River magic. Koa, who had been standing tall and regal, slowly, deliberately, lowered himself to the ground. He folded his powerful legs beneath him and lay down in the grass, an act of submission and gentleness that was breathtaking to witness. He then let out a soft, rumbling sigh and rested his great head on the earth, closing his eyes as if to show he was no threat. Maya watched, her own eyes wide with wonder. The terrifying giant had made himself small for her. Hesitantly, she stepped out from behind her teacher and approached the fence. With encouragement from Elara, she reached her hand through the railing and touched the thick, shaggy fur on Koa's head. A huge, radiant smile broke across her face as she felt the warmth and the soft texture. She turned to her teacher and her hands flew, signing a single emphatic word: friend. Later that day, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the sanctuary, Elara sat with Koa in the quiet pasture. This was their ritual, a time when the visitors were gone and the world belonged only to them. She leaned against his Warm, solid flank, her fingers idly tracing the patterns in his thick coat. The years of prosperity and peace, however, had made them forget the harsh, unforgiving nature of the plains. That summer was the driest in a century. The vibrant grasses turned to brittle yellow straw, and the creeks that crisscrossed the sanctuary lands slowed to a muddy trickle. The air grew thick with a hazy smoke that smelled of distant burning pine, a scent that put a nervous edge on every animal and human at Wind River. Elara, now 20 and a student of animal behavior through online university courses, felt the change not just in the air but in Koa. The bison, their anchor of calm, had become restless. He spent his days pacing the fence line of his vast pasture, his head held high, sniffing the wind. His deep, contented rumbles were replaced by low, anxious bellows that vibrated through the very ground Elara walked on. "He senses it, doesn't he?" Ben said to her one evening, his own face etched with the familiar lines of worry she remembered from their leanest years. "The fire, it's still 100 miles away, but he knows it's coming." The news reports confirmed Koa's primal intuition. A massive wildfire, dubbed the Dragon by firefighters, was consuming thousands of acres a day, driven by relentless winds and fueled by the drought-stricken landscape. Emergency services had begun issuing evacuation warnings for the outlying ranches and communities. A new figure of authority arrived at the sanctuary, a man who embodied the stark, pragmatic reality they were facing. Fire Chief Marcus Thorne was a man carved from granite in experience, his eyes holding the weary cynicism of someone who had fought and lost too many battles against nature's fury. He saw Wind River not as a place of miracles, but as a logistical nightmare. "You have over 200 animals here, Mr. Henderson," Thorne stated, his voice flat and devoid of sentiment as he surveyed the sprawling property. "Horses, elk, bison, not to mention the smaller creatures. Evacuating them will be next to impossible. My priority is human life. We can provide a few trailers for your most valuable assets, but the rest, you need to be prepared to make some hard choices." The phrase hard choices hung in the air, a cold echo of the words Ben had used about Koa a decade earlier. But this time, Elara was not a child pleading for 5 more minutes. She was a young woman who had built her life on the principle that every life had value. "Every animal here is a valuable asset, Chief Thorne," Elara said, her voice quiet but firm. She stood beside Koa's fence, the great bull's presence a solid wall of support at her back. "We will not abandon any of them." Thorne gave her a dismissive glance, his gaze lingering for a moment on her unseeing eyes. "Miss, I appreciate your passion, but passion doesn't stop a wall of fire moving at 30 miles an hour. We have protocols. We have evacuation routes. We don't have time for sentiment." Over the next 48 hours, the sky turned a bruised, apocalyptic orange. Ash began to fall like a soft gray snow, blanketing everything in a film of death. The evacuation order became mandatory. The chaos Thorne had predicted descended upon them. The rescued animals, many of whom carried the invisible scars of past traumas, panicked at the smell of smoke and the frantic energy of the humans. The horses reared and kicked in their stalls, refusing to be loaded. The herd of rescued elk scattered into the wooded parts of the sanctuary, making them impossible to round up. It was a nightmare. Thorne's team, with their limited resources, managed to evacuate a handful of the smaller, more manageable animals, but the vast majority remained. "It's over," Ben said, his voice cracking as he watched a trailer pull away, leaving dozens of terrified animals behind. "We can't save them all." But Elara had been listening to something other than the panicked cries of the animals and the frantic shouts of the humans. She had been listening to Koa. The bison's anxious bellows had changed. They were no longer just sounds of fear. They had become calls of command, of direction. He was moving with a new, urgent purpose, circling his own herd, but also calling out to the other animals across the sanctuary, his voice a unifying force in the chaos. "He has a plan," Elara said, turning to her uncle and the skeptical fire. "Chief, he knows a way out." Thorn stared at her as if she were insane. "A plan? Miss, that's a 2,000-pound animal, not a general. The only way out is the main road, and it's about to be cut off. We need to leave now." "No," Elara insisted, her conviction absolute. "The main road leads east, toward the fire's path. Koa keeps facing north, toward the Black Rock Canyon. He's been trying to tell us for days." Ben pulled up a topographical map on his tablet, his hands shaking. "The Black Rock Canyon? Elara, that's a dead end. The cliffs are too steep on the other side. It's a box canyon." "It's not a box," Elara said, her voice ringing with a certainty that came from a place beyond maps and logic. "It's a passage. Koa knows the land. He lived out here for years before he was captured. He knows the old ways, the animal trails that aren't on your maps. He's telling us the canyon will shelter us. The rock walls will act as a fire break." "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard," Thorn scoffed. "You want me to risk the lives of my men and your own people based on the instincts of a bison? We're leaving. I order you to evacuate with us." It was the ultimate test of faith. Every official protocol, every piece of human logic screamed that the fire chief was right. But every fiber of Elara's being, every lesson she had learned from a decade of listening with her heart, told her that Koa was their only hope. "We're not going with you," she said, turning to Ben. "Uncle Ben, you have to trust me. You have to trust him." Ben looked from the grim, determined face of the fire chief to the calm, resolute face of his niece. He looked at Koa, who was now standing at the northernmost gate of his pasture, bellowing with an authority that was impossible to ignore. It was the same choice he had faced 10 years ago, the choice between the cold logic of the world and the inexplicable magic he had witnessed with his own eyes. "Open the gates," Ben said to his stunned staff. "All of them." The decision sent a shockwave through the assembled firefighters and sanctuary workers. To open the gates seemed like an act of surrender, unleashing chaos. But as the latches were thrown, something incredible happened. The panicked animals, instead of scattering randomly, began to move toward the sound of Koa's commanding voice. The horses fell into line behind the bison herd. The elk, emerging from the woods, joined the procession. It was a migration born of instinct, a multi-species herd putting their trust in a single charismatic leader. "You're going to get them all killed," Thorn yelled, his face a mixture of fury and disbelief as he watched the animal exodus begin. Elara took a deep breath, the smoky air stinging her lungs. She held a long rope, one end tied to Koa's halter, a symbolic tether to the wild heart she was about to follow into the unknown. "No," she said, her voice carrying over the rising wind. "He's going to get us all saved." With that, she gave a gentle tug on the rope, and Koa began to move, leading his impossible arc away from the roaring fire and into the mouth of the dark, forgotten canyon. The journey into Black Rock Canyon was a descent into a primal world of smoke and shadow. The air was thick and hot, making every breath a struggle. The roar of the approaching fire was a constant, deafening thunder at their backs, a sound that vibrated through the very rock beneath their feet. Yet, within this terrifying symphony of destruction, a strange and powerful order emerged. Koa was the undisputed leader, his massive form a dark, unwavering beacon in the hazy twilight. He moved with a confidence that defied the surrounding chaos, his great head lowered as he navigated the rocky, uneven ground of the canyon floor. He chose his path with an unerring instinct, avoiding loose rock and treacherous drops that would have been invisible to human eyes in the dense smoke. Behind him, the impossible herd followed. Over 200 animals, predators and prey, domestic and wild, moved as one. The horses, who had been frantic with terror just an hour before, now walked with a tense but steady gait, their trust placed entirely in the bison leading the way. The herd of elk, normally skittish and unpredictable, formed a protective flank, their antlers like a moving forest of spears. Even the smaller animals seemed to understand, with rescued coyotes and deer moving side by side, their instinct for survival overriding their natural animosity. Elara was the human heart of this wild procession, holding the rope connected to Koa. She was the bridge between his primal knowledge and the small group of humans who had chosen to follow him. Ben, Dr. Sharma, and a handful of the most loyal sanctuary staff walked alongside her, their faces grim, but their eyes filled with a terrified awe. For Elara, the world was a heightened sensory experience. She could not see the glowing red embers that were beginning to fall around them like malevolent snowflakes, but she could feel their heat as they landed near her. She could not see the towering rock walls of the canyon, but she could feel their immense, protective presence through the way they echoed the sounds of the herd and blocked the worst of the wind. She navigated by the feel of the rope in her hand, the shifting tension telling her everything she needed to know about Koa's movements. She listened to the sounds of the animals behind her, the soft nickering of the horses, the shuffling hooves of the elk, the occasional bleat of a goat, weaving them together in her mind to form a complete picture of their arc. "He's slowing down," Ben said, his voice tight with anxiety. "The smoke is getting thicker. Maybe Thorn was right. Maybe it's a dead end." "No," Elara said, her voice calm and certain. "He's not stopping. He's listening." She could feel it through the rope. Koa had paused, his head raised, his entire body a finely tuned instrument sensing the world around him. He let out a low, questioning rumble, and from somewhere ahead, muffled by the rock and the roar of the fire, came an answering sound, the unmistakable gurgle of running water. "There's a creek," Elara breathed. He was looking for water. Koa moved forward again, his pace quickening. A few hundred yards later, the ground beneath their feet grew soft and damp. They had reached a small spring-fed creek that flowed from a fissure in the canyon wall, creating a ribbon of green, damp life in the heart of the rock. It was a place of impossible sanctuary. The air was cooler, the smoke less dense. The animals, driven by a desperate thirst, drank deeply from the life-giving water. Koa positioned himself upstream, standing guard, allowing the others to drink first. He was not just a guide. He was a protector, a king ensuring the survival of his subjects. As the fire raged above them, the canyon became their refuge. The towering rock walls, hundreds of feet high, acted as a natural shield, deflecting the intense heat and the river of embers that flowed overhead. They could hear the firestorm passing, a sound like 1,000 freight trains, but down on the canyon floor, they were miraculously safe. They were not alone in their awe. High on the ridge opposite the fire's main path, Fire Chief Thorn watched through a pair of powerful smoke-cutting binoculars. He had refused to abandon them completely, tracking their progress with a mixture of anger and a growing, grudging respect. His evacuation plan had fallen apart, but this blind girl and her bison were somehow succeeding. What he saw through his lenses defied every page of his operational handbook. He saw a herd of 200 animals, calm and organized, gathered around a water source in a canyon that his maps had dismissed as a trap. He saw a massive bison standing guard, a young blind woman leaning against its side, and a small group of people who had placed their faith in an animal's instinct over human expertise. He watched as the main wall of fire crested the ridge above. The canyon, a tidal wave of flame that should have incinerated everything in its path. He saw it lick over the canyon's edge, and then starved of fuel by the sheer rock and defeated by the updrafts from the cooler canyon floor. It passed over them, continuing its destructive march eastward. Thorn lowered his binoculars, his hands trembling slightly. He had just witnessed an impossibility. He had seen a miracle born not of technology or strategy, but of a connection he could not begin to comprehend. When dawn broke, it revealed a world transformed. The landscape was a monochrome canvas of black and gray, a smoldering skeletal forest where vibrant life had been just a day before. But from the mouth of Black Rock Canyon, a procession emerged, covered in soot and exhaustion, but alive. Every single animal, every single person. As they stepped out into the eerie, silent morning, they saw Thorn and his crew waiting for them. The fire chief walked toward Elara, his face stripped of its earlier arrogance, his eyes holding a new and profound respect. He didn't speak for a long moment. He simply looked from Elara to the magnificent Bison standing calmly at her side, a creature that had saved them all. "Your map," Thorn said finally, his voice raspy, "was better than mine." The story of the Bison's firebreak became the second great legend of Wind River Sanctuary. The rebuilding process was immense, but this time they were not alone. Donations and volunteers poured in from a world that had been captivated by their story of survival. Chief Thorn himself became one of the sanctuary's most ardent supporters, using his experience to help them design a new facility that worked in harmony with the land's natural defenses, incorporating fire breaks and establishing emergency protocols based on the lessons Koa had taught them. The sanctuary was reborn, its mission expanded. It became a center not only for therapeutic healing, but also for research into animal intelligence and interspecies communication, particularly in the context of environmental crises. Elara, now in her early 20s, was a leading figure in this new field, her unique perspective offering insights that traditional science had often overlooked. Years later, on a cool autumn evening, Elara, now Dr. Elara Henderson, stood with Koa on the ridge overlooking the regenerated sanctuary. The land, once black and barren, was now covered in a carpet of new green, a testament to nature's resilience. Koa, his great form now touched with the gray of age, stood beside her, his presence as solid and reassuring as the earth itself. Was a living legend, the warrior who had saved his kingdom not with force, but with an ancient wisdom that ran deeper than any human understanding. "We did it, old friend," Elara whispered, leaning her head against his warm, familiar flank. "We showed them." Koa let out a deep, contented rumble, the sound of perfect harmony with the evening wind. It was the sound of peace, of purpose, of a bond that had been forged in desperation, tested by fire, and had emerged as a beacon of hope for the entire world. The blind girl who saw with her heart in the Bison who carried the plains within. Him had faced the dragon and won. Their journey was a reminder that in a world that often values only what it can see and measure, the greatest strengths, the deepest truths, and the most profound miracles are often found in the unseen, in the spaces between heartbeats, and in the silent, unbreakable language of love. After the fire, the world saw Wind River not just as a sanctuary, but as a symbol. The story of the impossible exodus had cemented its legacy. But with fame came a new kind of scrutiny, one more insidious than fire and more complex than financial. Ruin. The new challenge arrived not in a truck filled with firefighters, but in a sleek, government-issued sedan. Dr. Alistair Finch was a man whose reputation preceded him. He was the head of the Federal Bison Conservation Program, a world-renowned biologist who saw the world through the cold, clear lens of genetic data and population statistics. To him, animals were not individuals. They were carriers of code, assets in a vast biological portfolio. He had read the stories about Koa with profound skepticism, dismissing them as sentimental anthropomorphism, dangerous narratives that undermined the serious work of preserving wild species. His visit to Wind River was not one of curiosity, but of acquisition. "Dr. Henderson," he began, addressing Elara with a tone that was technically polite but coated in condescension. They stood near Koa's pasture, the air crisp with the scent of new growth. "Your work here is charming, but Koa is more than a local celebrity. Our genetic testing has confirmed he is one of the purest wild bison specimens in North America. His genotype is a national treasure. Ben and Dr. Sharma stood with Elara, a familiar protective formation. We're aware of his genetic significance. Dr. Finch, Ben said. That's why his safety and well-being are our top priority. Finch gave a thin, dismissive smile. His well-being is precisely my concern. An animal of his importance cannot be left in what amounts to a therapeutic petting zoo. He's been habituated to humans, his wild instincts compromised. He belongs under federal jurisdiction in our national breeding program in Yellowstone. We need his genes to strengthen the national herd. The threat was clear and devastating. Finch wasn't just a skeptic. He was armed with the full power of the federal government. He had initiated a legal process to have Koa and a dozen other genetically significant animals at the sanctuary reclaimed for the national good. His argument was clinical and powerful. The needs of the species outweighed the sentimental attachments of a few individuals. You can't be serious, Dr. Sharma countered, her scientific pragmatism clashing with Finch's. You want to tear him away from the only home he's ever known peace in? After everything he's been through, the trauma would be immense. Trauma is an emotional projection, Dr. Sharma, Finch retorted coolly. What's scientifically verifiable is the degradation of his wildness. We need to preserve the bison, not the storybook. The battle that followed was fought not with hoses and shovels, but with legal briefs and media campaigns. The world that had celebrated Wind River was now forced to choose a side. Finch presented a compelling case, arguing that true conservation required tough, unsentimental decisions. He produced data, charts, and expert testimony about the importance of genetic diversity and the dangers of habituation. The sanctuary's defense was built on something harder to quantify: the evidence of Koa's consciousness, his intelligence, and his emotional depth. Elara became the heart of their defense. In interviews and articles, she spoke not of miracles, but of observable behavior, of communication, of a relationship built on mutual respect. Dr. Finch believes we have tamed Koa, she explained to one reporter, but what we have done is learn his language. We haven't taken away his wildness. We've simply created a space where he feels safe enough to share his wisdom. True conservation isn't just about preserving a species' body. It's about honoring its spirit. The legal battle culminated in a formal on-site evaluation. Finch arrived with a team of government biologists and a court-appointed mediator. Their goal was to conduct a series of tests to assess Koa's wildness indicators and determine if he was a suitable candidate for the federal program. It was a cold, clinical process. They wanted to test his flight response to perceived threats, his reaction to unfamiliar stimuli, his herd dominance behaviors. It was a day designed to strip away the myth of Koa and reduce him to a set of predictable, instinctual responses. The final test was to take place in a large, unfamiliar enclosure at the far end of the sanctuary. The plan was to separate Koa from Elara and the other animals he knew and introduce a controlled threat, a remote-controlled drone that would simulate a predator to gauge his reaction. As they led Koa toward the enclosure, a sudden violent change swept over the plains. The sky, which had been a clear, sharp blue, turned a leaden gray. The temperature plummeted, and a fierce wind began to howl, carrying with it the first stinging pellets of snow. A freak autumn blizzard, a common but always treacherous event on the northern plains, had descended upon them with terrifying speed. "We need to call this off and get back to the main building," Ben shouted over the wind. But Finch, determined to complete his evaluation, pushed forward. "We're almost there. The storm will pass." They managed to get Koa into the test enclosure, just as the blizzard hit with full force. The world dissolved into a blinding, swirling vortex of white. Visibility dropped to zero. The wind shrieked, and the snow began to pile up with alarming speed. In the chaos, a section of fence on the far side of the enclosure, weakened by the previous year's fire and now battered by the wind, gave way. And Dr. Alistair Finch, who had moved to the perimeter to get a better vantage point, was suddenly in peril. A heavy crossbeam, laden with snow, snapped and fell, pinning his leg to the frozen ground. He cried out, but his voice was swallowed by the storm. He was trapped, injured, and rapidly succumbing to the cold, invisible to his team, just 100 yards away. Inside the enclosure, Koa was not panicking. While the other humans scrambled for shelter, the great bison stood facing the wind, his body a solid anchor in the storm. Elara, unable to see but sensing the shift in the world's rhythm, felt a new kind of alarm. It wasn't the panic of the fire. It was a focused, directional urgency. "Something's wrong," she yelled to Ben. "Koa feels it. Someone is in trouble." Koa let out a deep, powerful bellow, not of fear, but of command. He began to move with purpose, not toward the gate and the familiar path back to his pasture, but toward the broken fence line and the source of the trouble. He was ignoring the drone, the official threat, and responding to a real one. Elara, holding fast to his halter, followed him into the whiteout. "Elara, come back!" Ben screamed, but she was already gone, a ghost disappearing into the storm. Her trust once again placed entirely in the bison. Koa led her with unerring accuracy through the blinding snow, directly to the spot where Dr. Finch lay. The biologist was barely conscious, his leg broken, his body shivering violently. Koa stopped beside the fallen man and did something extraordinary. He positioned his massive body to shield Finch from the worst of the wind, creating a wall of fur and muscle that deflected the driving snow. He then lowered his head and began to nudge Finch with his nose, his warm breath melting the snow on the man's face, his rumbles a low, insistent call back to consciousness. He was not just protecting. He was actively trying to save the man who had come to take him away. When Ben and the rescue team finally found them, guided by Koa's persistent calls, they discovered a scene that would forever be etched in their memories. Dr. Finch, alive and conscious, was being sheltered by the very animal whose spirit he had intended to break. Koa had not only sensed the danger to a member of his herd, but had used his intelligence and his innate understanding of the environment to protect him. It was a display of conscious, compassionate action that no scientific model could ever account for. Dr. Finch's recovery was long, but his transformation was immediate. From his hospital bed, he officially withdrew the federal claim on Koa and the other Wind River animals. When he was finally able to travel, his first trip was back to the sanctuary. He walked with a permanent limp, a constant reminder of the day his rigid worldview had been shattered. He approached Elara and Koa not with arrogance, but with a profound and humbling respect. "I came here to study a species," Finch said to Elara, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "But I was the one who was blind. I was so focused on preserving the genetic code that I forgot it was housed within a thinking, feeling being. Koa is not a specimen. He is a teacher." In the years that followed, Dr. Finch became Wind River's greatest champion. He helped secure federal grants that established the sanctuary as a national center for interspecies studies, a place where science and heart could work together. The Finch-Henderson Protocols, a revolutionary new set of guidelines for ethical animal research based on Elara's intuitive methods, became the gold standard across the world. Elara, with Koa always at her side, became a global voice for a new kind of conservation, one that sought to understand and communicate with other species, not just manage them. She taught the world that the line between human and animal was not a wall, but a bridge, and that the language of that bridge was empathy. On Koa's 30th birthday, a quiet celebration was held at the sanctuary. He was an old bull now, his movements slow, his greatcoat shot through with silver. He stood on the ridge overlooking the valley, the land vibrant and alive, a kingdom he had twice saved. Elara, her own hair now showing the first hints of gray, stood beside him, her hand resting on his flank. The world saw a renowned scientist and a legendary animal. But in the quiet space between them, they were still just a girl who saw with her heart and a warrior who carried the plains inside him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carrying on the same wind that had always been their confidant, "for everything." Koa turned his massive head and looked at her, his ancient eyes filled with a deep and abiding love. He let out one last, soft rumble, a sound that was not an ending, but a promise. It was the sound of a legacy, a story that would be told for generations, a reminder that the most powerful force in the universe is not fire or wind or the cold logic of men, but the simple, unbreakable bond between two hearts who dared to listen to each other. The peace that settled over Wind River was deep and resonant, like the final chord of a beautiful song. But the world outside the sanctuary's borders was not so tranquil. A shadow was falling over the great bison herds of the nation, a creeping, invisible blight that baffled veterinarians and conservationists alike. It began in the remote corners of Yellowstone, a mysterious wasting sickness that left the magnificent animals weak, disoriented, and eventually dead. It spread with terrifying speed, a silent plague that respected no fences and no boundaries. They called it the fading. Dr. Finch, now a close friend and collaborator, arrived at Wind River with a gravity that chilled Elara to the bone. His limp seemed more pronounced, the weight of this new crisis pressing down on him. He carried a sealed briefcase, and in the quiet of the sanctuary's research lab, he opened it. Inside were tissue samples, genetic charts, and a story of deception that was far more complex than his initial arrogance. "I wasn't entirely honest with you, Elara," Finch began, his voice low and strained. "My initial interest in Koa, it wasn't just about his pure genotype. There was something else. An anomaly in the blood work we took when we first processed him before the legal battle, before the blizzard. He projected a complex DNA sequence onto the lab's main screen. This is Koa's. And this," he said, pointing to a specific marker, a sequence unlike any other they had ever seen, "is a unique retroviral inhibitor, a natural flawless defense against a whole class of diseases." At the time, it was just a scientific curiosity. I wanted to study it, to understand it. My plan to reclaim him for the breeding program was a cover. I wanted him in my lab, where I could work to synthesize this immunity. Elara felt a cold dread creep over her. The man she had come to trust, to see as a convert to her way of thinking, had been playing a different game all along. "The blizzard," Finch continued, his eyes filled with a deep, weary shame, "was an accident. A humbling, life-altering accident. When Koa saved me, I saw the being, not just the code. I saw you, and I realized there was a better way. I believed we could study his gift here, collaboratively, under the guise of your communication research, without causing him harm. I never imagined we'd be in a race against time." He then revealed the true horror of the situation. The fading was a prion disease, similar to chronic wasting disease in deer, but it was mutating, evolving. And Koa's unique genetic marker was, theoretically, the only key to creating a vaccine. "We are on the verge of an extinction-level event for the American bison," Finch said, his voice cracking. "The wild herds are collapsing. We've tried everything. Nothing works. Elara, Koa is not just a treasure. He is their only hope." The dilemma he presented was a monstrous one. To synthesize the vaccine, they needed more than blood. They needed bone marrow samples, spinal fluid, and multiple tissue biopsies. The procedures would be highly invasive, painful, and for an animal of Koa's advanced age, extremely risky. There was a real chance the procedures themselves could kill him. It was a perfect, ethical nightmare. It pitted Elara's most sacred vow to protect the well-being of this individual being who had saved her, and so many others against the potential salvation of his entire species. To save the bison, she might have to sacrifice the one bison who meant more to her than anything in the world. "I will not allow you to turn him into a science experiment," Ben said, his voice a low growl. "Not after everything. Ben, do you think I want this?" Finch shot back, his own anguish clear. "I'm the man he saved. But if we do nothing, the animal he represents will vanish from the earth forever. What is the greater good here?" The question hung in the room, heavy and unanswerable. For days, Elara was paralyzed. She spent every moment with Koa, her hands tracing the lines of age on his face, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of his heart. How could she betray this trust? How could she subject her oldest, dearest friend to pain and fear, the very thing she had saved him from 2 decades ago? But then, as she sat with him on the ridge overlooking the valley, she felt a change in him. The old restlessness she had felt before the fire had returned. He would stand for hours, facing not west toward his lost freedom, but east toward the distant mountains of Yellowstone where his wild brethren were dying. He would let out low, mournful rumbles, sounds of a grief that was not his own, but a shared, collective sorrow. He knew, somehow, across the hundreds of miles, he could feel the fading. He could feel his species crying out. Elara realized the choice was not hers alone to make. Her entire philosophy was built on listening, on communication. She had to try and ask him. One evening, as the last light of day bled from the sky, she went to him. She didn't bring scientists or equipment. She brought only herself and the language they had shared for 20 years. She placed her hands on his great, shaggy head and opened her heart, pouring out the whole terrible dilemma, the sickness, the dying herds, the pain he would have to endure, the risk. She explained it not in words, but in feelings, in the silent language of their bond. She projected images of sorrow, of falling herds, and then the counter-image of hope of a cure, but at a great personal cost to him. When she was finished, she fell silent, her entire being focused on his response. Koa stood motionless for a long time, the wind whipping through his ancient coat. Then, he did something he had not done since that first day, so many years ago. He turned away from her and walked deliberately to the feeding trough. He took a mouthful of feed, chewed it slowly, and then turned back to face her, his gaze steady and clear. It was the same gesture he had used to signal his choice to live. Now it was a signal of his choice to give life. He would do it. He would endure the pain. The warrior had one last battle to fight. The decision was made, but the weight of it was immense. The procedures were scheduled, the world's best veterinary surgeons assembled. The fate of a species rested on the heart of one old bull, and on the promise of a blind girl who had taught the world that the greatest courage is found not in the absence of fear, but in the presence of love. The day of the procedure was the quietest day in Wind River's history. A respectful silence fell over the sanctuary as the veterinary team, led by a humbled Dr. Finch and a deeply anxious Dr. Sharma, prepared the mobile lab. Elara never left. Koa's sighed. As the sedatives were administered, she laid her head against his massive flank, whispering to him, her voice a constant, soothing presence in the encroaching fog of the drugs. She projected feelings of peace, of the green valley, of the cool water in Black Rock Canyon, building a world of comfort for him to retreat into. Throughout the long, arduous hours of the biopsies, she was his anchor. Her hand rested on his brow, her thumb stroking the coarse fur. The surgeons, marveling at his stability, did not realize that his calm was not a product of their chemicals, but of her presence. He endured it all with a stoicism that was heartbreakingly noble. His great heart, monitored on a screen that beat a steady rhythm of life, never faltered. He was fighting, not against them, but with them. The recovery was the hardest part. For 3 days, Koa lay weak and still. The warrior finally fell not by fire or blizzard, but by his own sacrifice. Elara slept in the straw beside him, her small form curled against his immense one, her own vitality seeming to flow into him. She fed him water with a sponge, cleaned his wounds, and never stopped speaking to him in their silent language. On the 4th morning, as the sun crested the ridge, she felt a familiar deep rumble vibrate through the straw. Koa's eyes were open, and they were clear. He nudged her hand, a weak but definite gesture. He had come back. 6 months later, Dr. Finch returned to Wind River. He held a small refrigerated case in his hands, as if it contained the crown jewels. Inside were the first 1,000 doses of the vaccine, synthesized from the miracle in Koa's cells. They named it the Koa factor. The vaccine was a stunning success. Airdropped via darts to the wild herds, it stopped the fading in its tracks. The sickness receded, and the great herds of Yellowstone and beyond began to recover. The bison, the symbol of the American wilderness, had been pulled back from the brink of extinction. Koa lived for 2 more peaceful years. He never fully regained the thunderous strength of his youth, but his spirit was undiminished. He spent his days grazing in his sun-drenched pasture, the revered elder of a kingdom he had saved 3 times over. His final moments came on a quiet evening, with Elara's head resting on his shoulder, her tears falling silently into his thick graying fur. He did not die from sickness or injury, but simply laid his great head down in the grass and let his heart, which had beaten so strongly for so long, finally rest. His passing was not a tragedy, but a graduation. The warrior had completed his duty. Today, at the entrance to Wind River Sanctuary, now a thriving global institution, stands a life-sized bronze statue. It is not of Koa alone. It depicts a massive bison lying peacefully in the grass, while a young blind girl rests against his side, her hand outstretched, offering a handful of feed. The plaque beneath reads simply, "Koa and Elara. They taught us not how to see, but what is worth seeing." And across the Great Plains, the bison roam free, each one a living testament to the old bull who chose to give life, and the blind girl who taught him it was a life worth living. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.